So now let's look at the DOM, basic concepts. So after this presentation, you'll appreciate the concept of a DOM and how it gets used. You'll understand the role of text nodes in a DOM, and you'll appreciate the concept of white space and how it is stored. So DOM, what does it mean? Document Object Model. When you load something into a browser, it gets converted into this DOM structure. Whatever you load HTML, it gets converted, XML, if you were doing that, will get converted, SVG, all of those things get converted into this DOM structure. Now, we're focusing mainly on HTML. Let's see an example. This is some code we've already seen. It was our first web page. Very simple, header section, body section, couple of things here, pretty straightforward HTML. If you load that into a browser, it gets displayed as this, okay, but we're not really focusing on how it gets displayed now, we're focusing on how it gets stored. Anyway, that's how it gets displayed, we've seen that before. In the memory, it gets stored in a certain way, and this is how it gets stored as what we call a tree structure. In computer science, a tree structure is basically start from something and then split and maybe do some more split, and it's like an upside down tree. So sometimes we call this kind of thing a tree structure. Now, so I've got the idea of that web page stored in memory, and it's stored in this kind of graph structure, a tree structure called a DOM. So at the top level, we have our HTML. Inside that, I'm sure you remember, was a head section and a body section. Both of those were under the HTML. And then inside the head section, we had a couple of things. So those go under that part of the DOM structure. In the body section, we had a couple of things as well. Now, there's a couple of key words. So let's just explain those key words. I use the word node a lot, N-O-D-E, node. All of these things here, all of these are nodes, and that language is just from discussing graphs, okay? So I use that a lot, the word node, and we have a top node. That top node is called the root. So sometimes I use the word root. It simply means the top, if you like, the top of the graph, okay? That's the root. What else do we have? We have some language where I use the word child. So, for example, this particular node here is a parent of two child nodes, okay? So we use the language parent, we use the language child, right? This particular node here is a child of this node here. We also use the language sibling, kind of like brother, sister, okay? But there's no gender concept, so we use the word sibling. This particular node here is a sibling of this one, meta. They are on the same line, if you want to use that language, and so they are siblings. Okay, so this kind of language is very commonly used when we talk about this. And then finally, we have this language branch. And so that, again, that's related to this language of trees. We have the language branch, and that means kind of area of this graph structure where you have one thing at the top and then it probably splits off into other things. We call that a branch, okay? You can think of it as an upside down branch, just like the whole thing is an upside down tree. Okay, so special language, branch, node, child, parent, all of these kind of things are very common when we talk about the DOM structure. Okay, so here we have the DOM structure, which is representing that web page we just saw. Okay, let's look at another DOM structure just to get more familiar with what we're talking about. So here's another web page, and there is a table in this web page, and it has a table body, which sometimes people don't write, but let's write table body. Inside the table body is a row. There's another row, and we've talked about tables before. And inside the row is a box and another box, and the second row has a box and another box. And so in your mind, you can build up the structure. Right, what does it look like? Okay, it looks like this. Okay, very simple. There's one column, there's another column, but we're not really talking about what does it look like. We're talking about the DOM structure. So we load that table into memory. This is the DOM structure. We have table node. Inside there is table body node. Okay, inside that was one row and another row. Inside that was two boxes, TD, table data. Inside the other row was two boxes. Inside those boxes were pieces of text. Okay, each box had a little piece of text. Now, in the DOM structure, that piece of text is its own node. It is a separate node underneath the thing which contains the text. So this box has this text, this box has this text, and this box has this text, and so on. These are text nodes, okay? They are text nodes. You don't actually type that when you type your HTML, but in memory, they are represented as separate nodes. Let's look at another example. So we've got a little bit more detail now, a bit more complex. But really, the main thing we've added is just some attributes. Okay, so we have an attribute here, we have an attribute here. The body has an ID, the paragraph, the first paragraph has an ID. And then what do we have? We have a piece of text. That text is not in any paragraph. It's not in anything, really. And then we have a break, and then we have another paragraph. That paragraph has an ID attribute as well. Now, these attributes are very useful when we start doing things with JavaScript, but we'll talk about that later. We're just saying what happens when we load this particular web page into memory. So all of these attributes, they don't get thrown away, they get preserved. Okay. So what does it look like? Okay, we just saw paragraph, text, paragraph, nothing very special. That's what it looks like. The DOM structure is what we're focusing on. So we have our body element. Let's focus on that downwards. That one had an attribute. ID is the body in this case. It could be any name, nothing special about this name. What was inside there? Well, we had a paragraph. We had a piece of text which wasn't inside anything. Okay, and you can see that visually. We have a paragraph. That was the first thing. That paragraph has an attribute, ID, like name. And then we had a piece of text which was not inside anything. It wasn't in a paragraph, it was just by itself. So that is a separate node by itself. And then we had a break, okay? That doesn't have any text in it. That is what we called a void element. We talked about that before. So it's just by itself. And then we have our last paragraph, and that one also had an attribute. That paragraph had some text inside it. The very first paragraph has some text inside it. Okay, so that is the DOM structure for that example here, okay? Basically, that's what happens. Now, we've got some familiarity with the DOM structure, loading a page, we know what happens. There are some surprises sometimes, so I want to talk about one surprise, and that is this thing called white space. And sometimes people say white space nodes. So what is white space? White space basically is anything you can't see, like spacing or an instruction to go to the next line. If you have an instruction which says go to the next line, then that is something you can't see. That is also white spacing. Now, you may have a text node, right? We just saw examples of the text nodes. And those text nodes may have only white space, all right? In other words, they don't contain anything that you can actually see, right? They just have some kind of maybe tabs or spacing or an instruction to go to the next line, something like that, right? Those text nodes are called white space nodes. Sometimes they're a little bit of trouble because programmers who are accessing the DOM, doing something clever with the DOM, they don't think about these white space nodes and their code doesn't work. So you have to be aware of them. So here's an example, very small. Body, this is the start of the code. Body, inside the body is a paragraph with some text, no problem at all, very simple. That does not have a white space node here, it does not. What about this one? Okay, body, and then next line, paragraph, bit of text inside it. That has a white space node, right? It has a text node right here after the body, before the P. It has a text node which contains nothing visible, but it contains a message which says, go to the next line. All right, so that is 1, 2, 3, actually 4 nodes there. That is 4 nodes. This one is 1, 2, 3 nodes. All right, 3 nodes, 4 nodes, because of the white space. So Here's an example, and we've got our body, which we're just talking about, and then we've got a message to go to the next line, and then we have a paragraph. What happens in the DOM structure? Well, it looks like this, okay? Nothing too surprising. In the DOM structure, we have our body, and then the very first thing that we just saw was actually a text node containing white space. People, if they're not used to this, they may think, oh no, the very first thing was a paragraph. And yes, the paragraph had a text node with a message inside it. That's what people might think. But you have to be careful. The first thing is actually, in that example, a text node with some emptiness in there, an instruction to go to the next line. All right, so that's the end of our introduction to DOM.